So I bought this car somewhat sight unseen. I'd only seen photos coming from Long Island, New York. Quite a ways away. I didn't fly out to look at it. I maybe should have. When we finally got it shipped, which actually was difficult in its own right because it was on the far end of Long Island and no car carrier wanted to go down to pick it up, they had to bring the car about an hour closer in order for them to be able to load it up in the first place. But when it finally got out here, I was looking it over and I discovered that at some point it had been in a pretty bad front end collision. And it had been repaired, but repaired kind of poorly. And you couldn't really tell as much from the outside of the car. But if you started looking, the front left fender had obviously been hit, the nose had been hit. When we stripped it off to repaint it, we discovered that most of the front left fender was made almost entirely of wrinkled sheet metal. So we ended up buying new heritage panels for Porsche, which is fantastic that you can do that you can still get them. And they fit beautifully, they're really good quality, they're expensive, but it allowed us to basically restore the car back to what it originally was like. This was largely a rust-free car when we got it. There was a little bit of rust to the bottom of the front trunk, right where the battery sits, that we had to patch. We got that taken care of. But otherwise, it's pretty much, other than the repaint, in the condition I got it in. We re-chromed a couple parts while we're at it, but for the most part, didn't really do much. The interior we've just left alone. The engine we pretty much just left alone. So it's just run great ever since I got it.
Now, I've always thought that the Porsche 356s are beautiful. I love that chrome strip down the nose. It's distinctive, it looks neat. And I like 911s and things like that too, but for me, this is what a Porsche should look like.
The problem I have with most of the six-cylinder Porsches is they tend to have really heavy clutches and things. That, and you've got a lot more weight behind the rear axle. So I feel that these actually handle better. These are also pretty easy to maintain because parts availability is fantastic, for the most part. I mean, there are some things that are harder to get, and some of the reproductions are good, some not as good. Depends sort of what you're looking for. And as sort of typical for cars like this, parts tend to be a bit more on the expensive side compared to some of the other brands.
Well, if I understand correctly, it's sort of like Ferrari versus Fiat, which it may be exactly the same part, but which name is on it.
Yep. Yeah, the Ferrari part may be the same door handle as the Fiat door, but you'll pay 8 times as much at least for the Ferrari badged one, or badged box, I should say, because the part doesn't actually have any labels on it, than you would if you were to buy the same thing from Fiat. That's kind of typical with a lot of those manufacturers.
Yeah.
A lot more of the Porsche stuff is unique to Porsche, so it's not necessarily the same kind of deal, but the problem is that makes it all expensive.
Yeah, because you can't just go, okay, what's the part number in the other brand? Yeah. Let's see if I can find it.
So I think the Roadster is actually my favorite version of the 356 as well. I mean, you've got 2 other convertible styles at least. The convertible D, which had a padded top, it's a much thicker top, but when it's down, it stacks up on the back. And I mean, it's probably nicer when you're actually driving it regularly with the top up. But in this car, I don't like putting the top up. I've got a coupe for when I want the top up. If I have to put the top up, unlike the Speedster, which although the Speedsters are typically the lightest and most collectible, they don't have roll-up windows. And I think that roll-up windows are absolutely a necessity if you want to drive a car regularly.
Especially if you want to drive it in Oregon.
Yeah. I mean, there are times that I have had the top up on this. I do fit underneath the top, which is great. And it does a pretty good job of keeping the weather out if I have to have it up.
But it's not a car you'd necessarily take on a really long road trip if you knew if it was going to be raining the whole time.
Exactly. Yeah, sadly, they didn't build that many Roadsters. There's only a few hundred that they made in the first place. Most of the bodies for Porsche tended to be bodied by different coach builders, kind of all through Germany. So you had, of course, Carmen bodied a bunch, Drew's bodied a bunch. This one is actually one of the more unusual things. This one was bodied in Belgium, but that makes it actually a pretty rare car because this is also what they call a T5 with a single grille in the back. I'd say another sort of downside of the Porsche 356 to some extent is it kind of does sound like a VW. I mean, it's a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed engine. It kind of has that same weird VW noise that you get off of a standard Volkswagen Beetle or something like that. Pretty distinctive, but not necessarily something we tend to associate with high performance. I mean, no offense to other Porsche owners, I'm not a massive fan of Porsches typically. They tend to all look a little bit the same. And I mean, I've got a bunch of them. They drive differently, and so they're enjoyable for the different driving experience, but you tend to have much the same look. But of all of them, I think the 356 is the nicest.
And I know that Porsche is very into their Porsche DNA. You should be able to look at any car and go, that's a Porsche. But that does lend itself toward that they all look alike, or at least extremely similar. That is one of the reasons why I like the 356, is I feel like it is more distinctive.
Yeah. And I mean, there are changes throughout the 356s because, I mean, you've got the pre-A's, the A's, the B's, the C's, all different variants. Each one, they've modified minor things here and there. I honestly think that the B's and C's are the cleanest looking. The C's probably a little bit cleaner than the B. They made some improvements to the design with the T6 cars. Some of the B's are also T6s. So, I mean, this car's drum brakes are 356C coupe, has disc brakes all around. So there are definite improvements that car has over this. But at the same time, you lost this really nice roadster design when they went to the C's. I mean, they built a convertible D instead. You could get a convertible D in that form, but it's just not the same nice car. I believe in this generation, the Super 90 like this was the second best engine you could get. The top, of course, being the Carrera 4-cam, basically race motor, that they were also selling as an option. So, but for road going one, this is about the most power that you got out of one, at least for this generation. It's a perfectly serviceable engine. It's not as fast as some of the other cars I have, even contemporary cars, but it definitely is a fairly nice car as far as the amount of power. The amount of power and the way the torque comes on and everything is pretty reasonable to actually make driving enjoyable. But these cars love curves. They love windy roads. They love these backcountry roads. They're just really, really nice.